4 million gallons a minute.
That is roughly how much water Hoover Dam was designed to push through its turbines when all 17 are running at full power. Right now, only 5 of those turbines are still operating.
The other 12 are either idle or approaching the point where turning them on would tear them apart from the inside.
And the water level that controls whether any of them run at all is dropping faster this summer than it has since the crisis year of 2022. Lake Mead, the largest man-made reservoir in the United States, sat at 1,041 feet above sea level on July 27, 2026.
That is less than 1 foot above the all-time record low set in July of 2022.
The reservoir is 27% full. It holds roughly 7,100 acre-feet of water out of a designed capacity above 26 million. And here is the part that separates this moment from every other low point in the lake's 90-year life. The federal government has just cut the amount of water flowing into Lake Mead from upstream on purpose, not because there is water to spare somewhere else, but because the reservoir above it, Lake Powell, is dying even faster.
To keep Glen Canyon Dam from losing all power generation, the Bureau of Reclamation
reduced its annual release from Lake Powell to Lake Mead by 1.48 million acre-feet through September of this year. That is 1.48 million acre-feet of water that Lake Mead was supposed to receive and now will not. The agency that runs both dams has publicly stated that this decision will accelerate the downstream decline of Lake Mead. They said those words in an official drought response package: accelerate the decline of a reservoir that is already less than a foot from its lowest point in history.
And that reservoir powers a dam that feeds electricity to 1.3 million homes across 3 states. I am Simone, and this is the part of the story that no headline has put together yet.
Because what is happening right now is not a drought update. It is a system that was built to work as one connected machine. Lake Powell feeding Lake Mead feeding Hoover Dam feeding the Southwest, and that machine is being taken apart piece by piece to keep any single part from failing completely. The problem is that all the parts are failing at the same time.
Start with what the system looks like today. If you stand on the Nevada side of Hoover Dam and look upstream,
the first thing you see is not water, it is rock. A white mineral stain runs along both walls of Black Canyon, stretching 187 feet above the current waterline. That is the bathtub ring, chalk-white calcium deposits left behind as the lake pulled back year after year. From the canyon rim, it looks like someone drew a line across the rock face with a piece of chalk the size of a building.
Below that line, dark, wet stone. Above it, bleached white.
The ring is now taller than a 15-story building. You can see it in satellite photos. You can see it from the observation deck at Hoover Dam without binoculars. It has been growing for more than 2 decades, and it has never been wider than it is right now. At full pool, Lake Mead stretches 110 miles toward the Grand Canyon and covers roughly 247 square miles. At 27% full, whole arms of the lake have pulled back to narrow channels. Marina docks that were built at the shoreline now sit hundreds of yards from the water. Boat ramps end in cracked mud. The floor of Black Canyon, buried under hundreds of feet of water when the dam was finished in 1935, is showing itself again for the first time in nearly a century. But the bathtub ring, as striking as it is only the visible part of the problem. The invisible part sits inside the dam. Hoover Dam makes electricity through a concept called hydraulic head. Water from the lake enters intake towers, drops through massive pipes called penstocks, and slams into turbines at the base of the dam. The higher the lake, the harder the water hits, and the more electricity the turbines push out. At full pool, roughly 1,221 feet, Hoover Dam has a nameplate capacity of 2,080 megawatts. That is enough to power about 1.3 million homes across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. For decades after the dam was finished, that power was cheap, steady, and massive. It helped build Las Vegas. It lit up Los Angeles. It ran pumps that pushed irrigation water across hundreds of miles of open desert. Today, with the lake at 1,041 feet, the Bureau of Reclamation estimates real-world output at roughly 500 to 600 megawatts. That is a drop of more than 70% from full capacity. And the numbers are about to get worse. 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines were built in the 1930s and 1940s for a lake that stayed between 1,100 and 1,200 feet. They were engineered to run on the weight of a water column that no longer exists. Below 1,035 feet, those 12 turbines hit a problem called cavitation. The water pressure falls so low that vapor bubbles form inside the turbine housings. Those bubbles collapse against the metal blades with enough force to chew through steel. Running a turbine in cavitation does not just reduce output, it destroys the machine. The Bureau of Reclamation will shut those 12 turbines down before that happens. That leaves 5 wide-head turbines, rebuilt between 2015 and 2016 at a cost of roughly $42 million, designed to work at lower pressures. Their combined output sits at about 382 megawatts, an 82% drop from what the dam was built to produce. Lake Mead is currently 6 feet above that 1,035-foot line, 6 feet. The July 2026 Bureau of Reclamation 24-month study forecasts the lake reaching 1,015 feet by July of 2027. That is not just below the cavitation line, it is 20 feet below it. If that forecast holds, Hoover Dam goes from one of the most productive power plants in the western United States to a structure running on 5 backup turbines at a fraction of its designed output. The Bureau has announced a $52 million investment in 3 new turbines that can generate power at elevations as low as 950 feet, but the agency itself has said that ordering and installing new turbines is a lengthy process. The timeline for completion remains unclear. Ed Garrick, executive director of the Irrigation and Electrical Districts Association of Arizona, which represents power providers that receive federal hydropower from Colorado River dams, called the coming power shortfall bad news for his members. A hydropower shortfall would not just raise prices, it would force utilities to buy replacement electricity from natural gas plants at 2 to 3 times the cost, and the people who feel that price increase first are the ones with the least room to absorb it. The Lincoln County Power District in eastern Nevada serves about 5,000 customers spread across 10,000 square miles of rural land. Hoover Dam supplies roughly 70% of the district's power. The district has been adding surcharges since 2022 to cover the rising cost of replacement electricity. Tribal utilities, including the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, face the same math. When Hoover Dam loses output, the backup power comes from fossil fuel plants, and the cost falls hardest on communities that have the least. Now pull back from the dam and look upstream. Because the reason Lake Mead is falling this fast in the summer of 2026 has less to do with drought alone and more to do with a decision that was made 400 miles away in April. Lake Powell, the second largest man-made reservoir in the country, sits behind Glen Canyon Dam on the Utah-Arizona border. It feeds Lake Mead. Whatever flows through Glen Canyon Dam eventually reaches Hoover Dam, and Lake Powell is in worse shape than Lake Mead. As of July 12, 2026, Lake Powell sat at 3,524 feet above sea level. That is roughly 175 feet below capacity, only 34 feet above the minimum power pool at 3,490 feet, and the lowest July reading ever recorded. The combined storage in Lake Powell and Lake Mead has now dropped below the level last seen in 1957, when Glen Canyon Dam was still under construction and Lake Powell did not yet exist. Jack Schmidt, director of the Center for Colorado River Studies at Utah State University, called this a milestone in the history of water storage in the Colorado River Basin. To keep Glen Canyon Dam from losing its ability to generate power entirely, the Bureau of Reclamation activated the Drought Response Operations Agreement in April 2026. 2 emergency actions followed. First, the Bureau ordered the release of up to 1 million acre-feet of water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir on the Wyoming-Utah border, more than 400 miles upstream from Lake Powell. That water travels down the Green River, joins the Colorado near Canyonlands in Utah, and flows into Lake Powell. The Bureau estimated these releases would raise Lake Powell by roughly 54 feet over the next year. The second action was the one that hits Lake Mead directly. The Bureau reduced the annual release from Lake Powell through Glen Canyon Dam from the standard 7.5 million acre-feet to just 6 million acre-feet through September 2026. That is 1.5 million acre-feet less water flowing downstream through the Grand Canyon and into Lake Mead. Think about what that means. Lake Mead is already at 27%. It is already less than a foot from its all-time low. And the federal agency that operates both dams made a deliberate choice to send less water to it because the dam upstream needed saving first. The Bureau is moving water from one sinking ship to another, and this time, the ship getting less water is the one that powers Hoover Dam. The upper basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, reluctantly agreed to the Flaming Gorge drawdown, but not without pushback. Wyoming's water commissioner warned that the release would likely close 3 of 5 boat ramps at the reservoir. Environmental attorney Chris Winter put the problem bluntly. You cannot release this much water from Flaming Gorge and expect it to refill if another dry year follows. The backup plan has no backup. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. We cover water systems, earth science, and geography stories like this as they develop, with the full picture you need to actually follow what is happening. The reason there is no backup has a name. It is the snowpack. Every drop of water in the Colorado River system starts as snow in the Rocky Mountains. That snow builds through winter, holds through spring, and melts between April and July, sending runoff downstream into Lake Powell and eventually Lake Mead. In a normal year, this spring runoff is the pulse that refills the system. In 2026, the pulse barely registered. Colorado recorded its worst snowpack in the entire period of recorded measurement. Statewide stored snow water on April 1st averaged just 3.3 inches, 22% of the 30-year average. The previous worst year, 2012, measured 9.1 inches. Of 64 snowcore sites, with at least 50 years of data, 60 recorded their lowest readings ever. Peak snowpack arrived on March 9th, nearly a month early, and then the melt began, sped along by a march that shattered temperature records across the state. The April through July runoff season, the window that is supposed to refill the system, is forecast at just 17% of normal for Lake Powell. Total water year inflow to Lake Powell is projected at 36% of the long-term average. NASA satellite images showed snow-covered area across the entire upper basin at roughly 40% of typical early March coverage, the lowest since satellite tracking began in 2001. What makes this year different from every previous bad snowpack year is the heat. Ben Livney, a water scientist at the University of Colorado, has been tracking the relationship between temperature and snowpack across decades of data. Past dry years were not this warm. Past warm years were not this dry. 2026 is a first-of-its-kind combination. Colorado's moisture through January was actually 89% of normal, close to average, but it came as rain, not snow. The warmth turned it into water that hit the ground and either evaporated or soaked into parched soil instead of building the frozen reservoir the entire system depends on. A dry year is a setback. A warm year that converts snow into rain is a structural shift in how the river recharges. And this is where the crisis stops being about weather and starts being about math. The Colorado River has been overpromised since 1922. That year, leaders from 7 states met in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and split up 16.5 million acre-feet of water per year, 7.5 million to the upper states, 7.5 million to the lower states, 1.5 million later promised to Mexico by treaty. The problem is, they based the split on flow data from an unusually wet stretch. Tree ring records, studied by climate researchers, show the river's true long-term average sits closer to 13 million acre-feet per year. Some years, it carries less than 10. The compact promised roughly 25% more water than the river has ever reliably carried. For decades, the massive storage in Lake Powell and Lake Mead covered the gap. The two reservoirs together can hold roughly 50 million acre-feet of water, enough to absorb years of overspending. But the savings account has been drawn down for a quarter century. Today, the combined storage in both reservoirs sits at roughly 19,100 acre-feet, 33% of total capacity, the lowest combined figure since before Lake Powell was built. Every year, the draw on the system exceeds what the river brings in, and every year, the cushion gets thinner. Now zoom in on the people who are already feeling this. In Pinal County, Arizona, about an hour south of Phoenix, farming families have watched their Colorado River water vanish. The Central Arizona Project Canal, a 336-mile concrete channel that carries Colorado River water across open desert to central and southern Arizona, delivers water to farms, cities, and tribal nations. When the Bureau of Reclamation declared a Tier 1 shortage in 2022, Pinal County farmers were among the first to lose their supply. They held some of the lowest priority water rights in the state. Fields that had grown cotton, alfalfa, and grain for decades went dry. Hundreds of acres of cracked brown earth replaced green rows, and the cuts have deepened every year since. An estimated 40% of roughly 200 farms in the county are expected to leave fields unplanted this year. Families who have farmed the same land for generations are facing a choice between planting a crop they cannot water and walking away from land they cannot sell. Cotton farmer Rodney Shedd and his wife Tiffany are leaving their fields unplanted for the first time in their family's history on that land. The water that made their farm possible has been cut again and again since Tier 1 shortage kicked in. This year, the numbers finally made planting impossible. Land that was green last spring sits brown and dusty this summer. The Gila River Indian Community and the Colorado River Indian tribes, tribal nations that negotiated water settlements after decades of legal battles, contributed water savings that added 11 vertical feet of reservoir recovery during the brief 2023 rebound. Those tribal contributions helped save the system during its closest brush with collapse. And now the system is back at the same level it was before those contributions were made, heading lower. For communities that fought for generations to secure water rights, watching those rights shrink alongside everyone else's carries a weight that goes beyond economics. 300 miles upstream, the picture is the same. Rancher and photographer Pete McBride watches the irrigation ditch that has fed his family's ranch in Colorado for generations. In May of 2025, at what should have been the height of spring snowmelt, his water commissioner called and ordered him to shut off the ditch. The creek was running nearly dry. McBride had never received that call before. The 0% snowpack feeding that same creek in 2026 is far worse than what triggered that first ever shutoff order. And then there is Las Vegas. The city of 2.3 million residents that gets roughly 90% of its drinking water from Lake Mead through a system that was not supposed to be needed this soon. The Southern Nevada Water Authority built what is known as the Third Straw, a 3-mile-long tunnel drilled through solid rock beneath the floor of Lake Mead. The tunnel connects an underwater intake sitting at roughly 860 feet above sea level to pumping and treatment plants on shore. Dead pool for Lake Mead, the point where water can no longer flow through Hoover Dam by gravity, sits at 895 feet. The Third Straw sits 35 feet below that. Building began in 2008 and took 7 years. The tunnel broke through on December 10, 2014, and went live in September 2015 at a cost of $817 million. A second project, the Low Lake Level Pumping Station, came online in 2020 and began full operations in April 2022, adding pumping capacity down to 875 feet. That station cost another $522 million. Total infrastructure cost for the system that keeps Las Vegas drinking water flowing sits at roughly $1.5 billion. The original intake number 1, built in 1971 at roughly 1,050 feet, broke the waterline in April of 2022 and is now useless. Intake number 2, built in 2000 at roughly 1,000 feet, still functions but grows more vulnerable with every foot the lake drops. Las Vegas has also cut per capita water use by 55% since 2002, dropping from 222 gallons per day to 89 gallons per day in 2023, even as the metro area added over 800,000 people. The city recycles 85% of its indoor wastewater, treating it and pumping it back into the lake. That is the highest recycle rate of any Colorado River Basin state. Las Vegas built the tunnel, slashed demand, and recycled nearly everything, and the lake kept falling. That tells you something about the scale of the problem. A city that spent $1.5 billion and cut its water use in half still cannot outrun the math of a river that carries less water than it has promised. Against that backdrop, 7 states need to agree on new rules for sharing whatever water remains, and they have been failing at it in real time. The current operating rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the 2007 interim guidelines, the 2019 drought contingency plans, and international agreements with Mexico all expire at the end of 2026. The Bureau of Reclamation must issue a record of decision on new rules by October 1st of this year. That is roughly 2 months from today. The 7 states have missed every major deadline leading up to that date, November 11th, 2025, for an early agreement. Missed. February 14, 2026, for a final seven-state proposal. Missed. The negotiators walked away from a December 2025 summit in Las Vegas with nothing. They walked away from a February 2026 session trading blame in press statements the same afternoon. In February, the governors of Arizona, California, and Nevada released a joint statement. Arizona offered to cut its Colorado River allocation by 27%. California offered 10%. Nevada offered nearly 17%. Their demand was straightforward. All 7 states must share the responsibility of conservation. The upper basin states have not accepted those terms. Colorado's water leadership has pushed back, arguing that the upper basin has never used its full water share. They use roughly 4.5 million acre-feet per year against a paper promise of 7.5 million. In their view, they are being asked to solve a problem they did not create with water they do not have. Both sides have a point. That is what makes this so dangerous. In May of 2026, the lower basin states advanced a bridge proposal offering 3.2 million acre-feet of water savings through 2028, including 1.25 million acre-feet in annual reductions, plus at least 700,000 acre-feet of additional conservation. The proposal is designed as a short-term fix while longer-term rules are worked out. The upper basin has called for a mediator. The lower basin says it is open to mediation, but insists that current conditions require immediate, verifiable cuts from every state. And while the states argue, the Bureau of Reclamation has made clear it will act with or without state agreement. In June, the agency announced it will impose a 10-year management framework if the states cannot reach consensus. The final environmental impact statement is expected by the end of this month. On July 23, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum convened a virtual meeting of all 7 governors. California sent stand-ins instead of the governor attending in person. The mood was described as cautiously hopeful, but the gap between the states remains wide. Arizona has hired a high-powered law firm and sharply increased its legal budget. If talks fail, this fight moves to federal court. And during every year of litigation, the river keeps responding to the same inputs it always has: snowpack, temperature, and evaporation. All 3 are pushing in the same direction. Here is a fact that puts the entire situation into scale. The Colorado River, the river that carved the Grand Canyon over 6 million years, no longer reaches the ocean. For most of the last 25 years, the river dries up in the Sonoran Desert, somewhere south of the Mexican border, miles before it would touch the Gulf of California. The river mouth, that once spread across nearly 2 million acres of wetland, is now mostly dry mud and salt flats. A river that cut a canyon a mile deep cannot finish its own trip to the sea. That is how far the gap between supply and demand has stretched. So where does this leave the dam? Hoover Dam itself will stand for centuries. It is roughly 5 million cubic yards of concrete locked into the volcanic rock of Black Canyon. Engineers built it to outlast the civilization that made it. But a dam without water behind it is a landmark, not a power plant. And a dam with water dropping 6 feet from the turbine shutdown line, heading toward a federal forecast of 1,015 feet by next July, with snowpack at record lows, upstream releases cut, and 7 states unable to agree on who gets less, is a dam running out of the one thing its builders assumed would always be there. And there is one more threat that nobody who poured the concrete in the 1930s could have imagined. The water in Lake Mead is warming. Inflow temperatures are tracking at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit above historical averages heading into fall. The dam's turbines are cooled with water drawn from the reservoir. If that cooling water reaches 78.8 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 or more consecutive days, the turbines face mechanical breakdown. The same water that is too low to spin the old turbines may soon be too warm to cool the new ones. The white bathtub ring on the canyon walls now stretches 187 feet above the waterline. The reservoir holds less water than it did at any point since the lake was first filled in the 1930s, save for a few weeks in the summer of 2022. The combined storage in Lake Powell and Lake Mead has not been this low since before Lake Powell existed. The Bureau of Reclamation will release its final plan within days. 7 state governments have roughly 8 weeks to agree on who takes less of a river that already does not carry enough. And every day, while the meetings continue and the press statements go back and forth, Lake Mead drops a little further, the turbines spin a little slower, and the white ring on the canyon walls climbs another inch closer to a line that engineers labeled 895 and hoped nobody would ever have to think about. If you want to see what happens when the Bureau releases its final plan and the October deadline arrives, subscribe. We follow this story as it develops, with the numbers, the names, and the full picture you need to understand what is actually happening to the water system that 40 million people depend on.